I have covered the article Psychiatry and the Presumption of Expertise, Flipping Coins in the Courtroom from 1974 at length. The article primarily focuses on involuntary commitment, but at the time I was interested in its broader implications for the mental health industry and its problems as a whole. But now I had further points I wanted to highlight regarding involuntary commitment more specifically, and for that I will return to more recent literature. The bottom line, to offer an upfront summary, is that the rate of involuntary psychiatric detention in recent years has greatly increased, at least in about half the U.S. states. The data available is terribly incomplete, highlighting further issues. Such involuntary commitment is based on the presumption of psychiatric expertise, despite decades of research and arguments available about the inadequacies of such judgments. Predictions of dangerousness are especially problematic. Individuals designated as mentally ill may also be subject to incarceration, even by simple psychiatric determination that they might benefit from treatment. Research further suggests that such involuntary commitment, when it is perceived as coerced, and perhaps even psychiatric hospitalization more generally, increases, not decreases, risk of suicide after hospitalization. Given the implications, at absolute minimum, the involuntary commitment numbers should be properly reported so thorough studies on the involuntary commitment process can be conducted. The lack of transparency on this issue, given the history of the mental health industry, is quite disturbing. To begin, I was able to find the article Incidences of Involuntary Psychiatric Detentions in 25 U.S. States in full by G. Lee, Master of Social Work, MSW, and David Cohen, MSW, PhD. This is from Psychiatric Services 2021. These numbers are quite complicated, so I will read the results section of the abstract. All ages rates per 100,000 people of emergency detentions range from 29 in Connecticut to 966 in Florida. In 22 states with continuous 2012 through 2016 data, the average rate increased from 273 to 309. In 4 or 5 states with separate counts for adults and minors, rates over time for both were nearly parallel. In 8 states that provided relevant data, the mean longer-term detention rate was 42% of a state's average emergency detention rate. Only 1 state provided length of stay data, and 1 counted both detentions and persons detained. In 24 states, accounting for 51.9% of the U.S. population, 591,402 emergency involuntary detentions were recorded in 2014, the most recent year, with most states reporting a crude rate of 357 per 100,000. This is not an insignificant number of individuals. But to turn to the conclusion of the main body, the discretionary rather than mandatory nature of commitment laws reflects society's ambivalence toward coerced care, and professionals and laypersons readily admit their mixed feelings on the subject. The vague way that many sources define their counts may also reflect this ambivalence. However, from whatever ethical angle one views commitment, it has profound implications for society. Therefore, state and private agencies, lay and professional groups, and independent researchers should shed more light on involuntary psychiatric detentions, their correlates, and their outcomes. Our findings imply that for the near future, it will remain difficult to study inpatient commitment empirically, except in single jurisdictions at a time. To assess the broader effects of civil commitment as a primary institutional response to a person's breakdown seems a more distant prospect. That only a single state reported data on the full length of involuntary detentions seems baffling in this era of electronic records. Why some states report detentions fully, whereas others do not publish the simplest aggregate counts, should be better understood. The findings of this study signal the need for a meaningful, nationally standardized data collection approach to produce valid population-based estimates of a major rights restrictive procedure that mobilizes considerable human, economic, and logistical capital across all behavioral health and justice systems in the United States. There is no reason, no possible justification for not recording these numbers properly. That is the bottom line. But beyond society's potential ambivalence toward coerced care, I would also suggest that the criteria for involuntary commitment might play a role in the vague way some involuntary commitments are counted. Involuntary commitment from the Cleveland Clinic. last medically reviewed in February 2025. What are the criteria for involuntary commitment? The criteria for civil commitment may look slightly different in each state. The general criteria include: you have a mental health condition that has serious symptoms. These can significantly impact your perception, mood, judgment, and behavior. Symptoms pose an immediate health and safety threat to yourself and/or others. Symptoms prevent you from completing basic personal needs like eating meals, wearing clothes, and accessing shelter. You would benefit from treatment in a hospital for this mental health condition. This is obviously an incredibly low bar or justification for coerced treatment. What conditions does involuntary commitment help? Some of the most common mental health conditions that involuntary commitment may help you manage include, but aren't limited to, the following: mental health conditions like schizophrenia, mood disorders like major depression and bipolar disorder, drug-induced psychosis, suicidal ideation, dementia with associated psychiatric symptoms. These conditions don't always require involuntary commitment, but they may if you're in danger. Here, the obvious implication is that the individual may be in danger or dangerous by virtue of the fact that he or she is mentally ill. More on all of this in a moment. Again, in the case of involuntary commitment, who is the one determining when an individual is dangerous? Hold or not to hold. Navigating Involuntary Commitment by Jason A. Barrett, MD. This is from Current Psychiatry, 2022. The bottom line: psychiatrists are entrusted with recognizing when a patient, due to mental illness, is a danger to themselves or others and in need of treatment. The implication, by extension of course, is that they also determine who might need or could benefit from treatment. Civil Commitment in the United States by psychiatrists Megan Testa, MD, and Sarah G. West, MD. This is from Psychiatry, Edgemont, 2010. Unintended consequences of basing civil commitment on dangerousness rather than a need for treatment. Although the shift towards strict dangerousness criteria for civil commitment was based on the honorable intentions of protecting the rights of individuals with mental illnesses and ensuring that they received effective treatment delivered in the least socially disruptive setting, serious unintended negative consequences have occurred. Because an inpatient stay is often the first step in treatment for people with mental illness, one consequence of the shift toward dangerousness criteria has been compromised access to psychiatric care for non-dangerous individuals with mental illness who need but are refusing treatment. Under treatment-driven criteria for commitment, these persons would have gained access to the system through hospitalization on an involuntary basis if necessary. And I will just add here, the process of psychiatric diagnosis and treatment is not harmless. Any arguments for involuntary commitment that does not include a clear acknowledgement of the potential harm psychiatric diagnosis and treatment can cause should be immediately dismissed. But the argument could not be clearer here. Don't stop at dangerousness. Also involuntary commit individuals if they might need help but don't want it as well. As the psychiatrists conclude, living with a mental illness can be a difficult experience because of the effects that the disorders can have on the perception of reality and the distortion of an individual's judgment. These alterations may place the patient and others in danger. Again, you see a call to dangerousness. Being mentally ill is equated to the potential of being dangerous. And at another point in time, I will also explore the mental health industry's fixation on distortion. But here I will reiterate a passage from the 1974 article, Psychiatry and the Presumption of Expertise, Flipping Coins in the Courtroom. Training and experience do not enable psychiatrists adequately to predict dangerous behavior. Rather, such predictions are determined by the time and place of diagnosis, the psychiatrist's personal bias, social pressures, the class and cultures of the respective parties, and other extraneous factors. Even if psychiatrists could accurately determine which persons are mentally ill, that determination would not assist them in predicting dangerousness because, as has been previously noted, there is no correlation between mental illness and dangerous behavior. To the contrary, the mentally ill may even be less dangerous than the population as a whole. To pull from something more recent, danger, the defendant is disturbed, risk of using psychiatric assessments to predict future dangerousness, by Myra Reyes. This is from the Connecticut Public Interest Law Journal, 2017. Here the authors specifically address how psychiatric evidence, including predictions of dangerousness, is used in the U.S. criminal justice system to determine a defendant's risk for recidivism. Studies indicate that medical knowledge has not yet advanced to the point where long-term predictions of future dangerousness can be made with a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Interestingly enough, as the article notes, in capital cases at least, even the American Psychiatric Association, APA, and the American Psychological Association have objected to such use of predictions of dangerousness. As Reyes writes, if due process and the right to a fair trial mean anything, it should mean that an individual shall not be deprived of his or her liberty based on a speculation about future conduct, no matter how qualified an expert is to provide that speculation. And take it for what you will, but in my search for articles on the ability or lack thereof to assess dangerousness from the past 20 years, any other article pertaining to dangerousness simply marked it as a process in involuntary commitment proceedings. In most cases, with the authors highlighting how, by virtue of being mentally ill, an individual may be likely to harm themselves or others. And to address that point from a more recent article, I did find the following abstract. Unfortunately, the article in its entirety is behind a paywall. Evolving public views on the likelihood of violence from people with mental illness, stigma, and its consequences. By Bernice A. Pescosolido, Bianca Manago, and John Monahan. This is from Health Affairs 2019. Highly publicized acts of violence routinely spark reactions that place blame on the perpetrator's presumed mental illness, despite solid evidence that people with mental illness are unlikely to be dangerous. Such prejudice can lead to support for inappropriately using legal means to force people into treatment. In other words, by use of involuntary commitment. We examine trends in public perceptions of violence and support for coerced treatment across a 22-year period, using data from 3 national stigma studies. These studies gave respondents one of 3 vignettes describing people who met clinical criteria for mental disorders, or one describing a person with non-clinical daily troubles. Perceptions regarding potential violence and support for coercion generally rose over time, significantly so for schizophrenia. By 2018, over 60% of respondents saw people who met criteria for schizophrenia as dangerous to others, and 44 to 59% supported coercive treatment. 68% saw people with alcohol dependence as dangerous to others, and 26 to 38% supported coercion. Lower but substantial percentages were reported for people with depression and, remarkably, for those with non-clinical daily troubles, who are viewed as dangerous. These findings reflect political discourse, not scientific data, and could lead to policies that would be ineffective and misdirect the research for the underlying roots of violence while unnecessarily increasing stigma toward people with mental illness. Now to emphasize, and I will do this periodically, given the well-documented fact that there are no biological tests, markers, or well-controlled studies identifying a biological lesion for any mental disorder classification, to cite the article After DSM-5 by Jeffrey Lacoste, given the subjective nature of these supposed conditions, it seems more than appropriate to look at the very terminology, the idea of mental illness, as a poor metaphor, to follow the logic of psychiatrist Thomas Szasz. All that being said, who is helping keep the stigma that the mentally ill are likely to be dangerous going? Look no further than the psychiatrists calling for the mentally ill to be forced into their care if they refuse treatment, based on the idea that the mentally ill individual could be a danger to themselves or others. But the basis for involuntary commitment does not stop there. To reiterate, the threshold for involuntary commitment may be set as low as the individual would benefit from treatment in a hospital for a mental health condition. And again, the key figure making such a determination will be a psychiatrist or a mental health professional, a figure known, for decades known, to be biased in favor of incarceration and coerced treatment. And next, I will turn towards the potential unintended consequences, to put it nicely, of incarceration and coerced treatment. I hope to see you there.